All right. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever applies. I'm sure you are pumped to watch a lecture about a very long meeting. But honestly, for meetings, the Council of Trent is a pretty interesting one. And I hope that you'll take away a few things that are a little bit intriguing to you. I wanted to start before I get into the council itself by saying that, I'm a good American. I believe that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but people are not necessarily entitled to having their opinions taken seriously. And I think that's true in the case of people's opinions about the Roman Catholic Church, whether the person is Catholic, Protestant, or neither. You would imagine if you ran into a European, and this European was, you may be European, so you have to imagine something else. But imagine, the European is spouting off all of these opinions about the United States, and then it comes to light that this European in question doesn't know anything about the Constitution, has maybe not even heard of the Constitution, or at least doesn't know anything about it. You would immediately think, okay, well, this is not someone's opinion that I have to seriously entertain. And so I think a lot of people who have strong opinions, maybe positive, maybe negative, somewhere in between, about the Roman Catholic Church, and yet would not know anything about the Council of Trent, I don't think that's an opinion that you probably need to take terribly seriously. The Council of Trent plays a huge role in determining the course of the Roman Catholic Church in the modern era. Perhaps in some ways, at least, analogous to the Constitution of the United States. So that brings me to the first thing I want to say. I want to give you a couple of reasons why you might be motivated to know something about the Council of Trent. The first reason I've already given you, right, that it will help you to understand the Roman Catholic Church of the last half millennium. Another reason to do this lecture, or to share this lecture with you, is to sort of bring to a conclusion a story that we have been tracking really all semester long. The story of criticism of the church. We've seen this with Dante, with Chaucer, Wycliffe, Huss, Erasmus, Luther, Calvin. There's been lots and lots of criticism in the Catholic Church from the medieval period onward. And the Council of Trent, among other things, is the church's acknowledgement that the church does, in fact, need to be reformed. Now, of course, many people are not going to be satisfied by Trent's measures, but nevertheless, it was an attempt. Finally, the Council of Trent really is kind of the Catholic Church's official response, certainly most definitive response, to the phenomenon of the Protestant Reformation. So we can't really sort of close the book on the Protestant Reformation without taking stock of what the Catholic Church sort of definitively said about it. Okay, so it's really the defining moment of the Counter-Reformation. Now, our first question is, why in the world, especially since this council, sorry, I'm trying to move myself around out of the way here. Why did the council start so late? If the Council of Trent is the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517, then why in the world does it not begin until 1545? Many, many decades afterwards. And there are a number of reasons for this. Number one, councils in general made popes very, very nervous, and they had good reason for this. So think back to the Council of Constance, which we studied in Unit 1, lasted from 1414 to 1418. This is the council that ended the Great Schism, but it ended the Great Schism by deposing the very Pope who called the council into existence in the first place. So that's enough to make any Pope nervous about calling a council. Moreover, all of the turmoil in the church in the 15th century had brought about a movement known as conciliarism. The conciliarists were those Catholic Christians who believed that ultimately councils were more authoritative, more powerful than the popes themselves, and that sometimes councils needed to be called in order to discipline popes. Obviously, the popes themselves are not going to be terribly keen on conciliarism. And so because of that whole legacy, again, councils were things that made popes rather jittery. But we also have to factor in political and military factors as well. You read last unit, about the wars going on between the Holy Roman Empire and France in the first half of the 16th century. These are known as the Habsburg-Valois Wars. Habsburgs are the ruling dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire, Valois, the ruling dynasty of France. And so that was a distraction. And moreover, the King of France during this time, Francis I, he had sort of earned the right to personally appoint all the bishops in France. And he was afraid that maybe if a council was held, he would lose that prerogative. So he himself was none too sort of ready to call a council. Okay, but the upshot is this. Here's what's most important. The fact that the council does start so late all but guarantees that reconciliation with the Protestants is going to be an impossibility. It's just too late. The numerous Protestant groups that existed by this time had already had an opportunity to sort of formulate their own doctrines, to establish and elaborate their own institutions. And so whatever the Council of Trent was going to accomplish, it was not going to effect true reconciliation between Protestants and Catholics. All right. Well, given these obstacles, given the delay, how did it come about that this council happened at all? So we need to talk a little bit about Pope Paul III. You can see the dates of his pontificate there. He became Pope in 1534, and it was one of his ambitions to call a council to address the Protestant Reformation. So he was less wary of councils than some of his predecessors were. But again, you know, convening a general council of the church is no mean feat. And, you know, for one thing, he had to find a location for the council that everyone agreed on. And ultimately, the location settled on was the city of Trent, which is modern day Trento in Italy, which was a good location because it was technically in the Holy Roman Empire. So this is on the turf of Emperor Charles V, but it was on the Italian side of the Alps, which meant that it was relatively accessible to the city of Rome and to the papacy. Okay. So in 1542, Pope Paul III declared that a council would convene in Trent. But because of the war, the Habsburg-Valois War, the council was not actually able to convene until 1545. And that brings up another issue. You know, a lot of times you see maybe in a textbook that the Council of Trent lasted from 1545 to 1563, and you think, oh my God, that I cannot imagine a meeting that lasts almost 20 years. Well, it was a long meeting, however you slice it. But I wanted to show you that there were long hiatuses at various junctures. Okay, so this was not a meeting that lasted 18 consecutive years. And again, I don't need to go into all the reasons why there were these hiatuses. I will mention one factor, which is that there were outbreaks or feared outbreaks of plague. So I think we can relate to that in 2021 more than we could a couple of years ago. All right, well, let's get into the council itself. First of all, who's there? Who's participating? Who's in charge? Well, anytime we talk about a church council, especially a general church council, we're basically talking about an assembly of bishops. It's the bishops who have voting rights, the bishops who are ultimately making the decisions at the councils. Okay. But that doesn't mean they're the only people there. There were sort of theologians who acted as theological consultants, and these were mostly Dominican and Franciscan friars. There were envoys sent by rulers, so people who were not employed by the church, but who represented various rulers of Europe. There were, last but not least, papal legates, so sort of ambassadors from the Pope. But interestingly, at least in the case of the Council of Trent, the Pope or the popes, because by 1563, Pope Paul III was not Pope anymore, the popes never actually stepped foot in Trent during this time. They sent legates to represent them and to sort of rule over the council in their stead. And this led to a tricky problem of communication, because even though Trent was on the Italian side of the Alps, it still took a minimum of 6 days. If a question came up and somebody wanted to consult the Pope, what's the Pope think about this? It would take a minimum of 6 days to get the message to the Pope and have a response come back. And often these questions or inquiries and the answers were encrypted. They were in code so that they could not be intercepted. So there's a little dash of intrigue involved there as well. Okay, but the heart of the issue, what is Trent for? What is it trying to do? What was the point of it? Well, I already mentioned the fact that the point of it by 1545 really was realistically not to sort of bring all the Protestants back to the bosom of the church. But that didn't mean that there wasn't important work to do. Okay. And there really were two major tasks that Trent undertook. The first is to articulate as precisely as possible what were the doctrinal differences between Roman Catholics and Protestants. Now, sometimes similarities or points of commonality were articulated as well, but they wanted to be particularly clear about what was different. And then secondly, the agenda was to reform the Catholic Church and to improve its pastoral ministry. So from the very beginning, there's this sort of dual focus of the Council of Trent, to focus on what makes Catholic doctrine distinct. So that is sort of what we would describe as the Counter-Reformation element. But there was also an equally important attempt to bring about reform from within the church. So that's the sort of Catholic Reformation element. All right, so I'm going to sort of follow the pattern of the proceedings at Trent by first addressing some doctrinal issues and then some reform issues, just to give you a sampling, just to give you some flavor of the kinds of things that were being discussed and implemented at Trent. So we'll start with doctrine, and why not begin with the doctrine that ultimately led to Martin Luther's break from the Catholic Church, the doctrine of justification. How can we be justified by God? How can we be saved given our deep sinfulness. Okay. There had never before been a time when the church had sort of delivered an official doctrine of justification. But of course, now was the time. Now, I'll just remind you of Luther's view. Luther's view is encapsulated in the phrase justification by grace alone through faith alone. Okay? Faith alone. What the Council Fathers at Trent wanted to do was to stake out the Catholic Church's position on justification, to find a kind of happy medium between two extremes. One extreme was Luther's own view, and the other extreme was the view of an ancient heretic named Pelagius. You might remember that name from Dr. Farmer's lecture last semester. Pelagius was someone who believed that we were at least theoretically capable of bringing about our own salvation apart from God's grace through sheer moral effort. So the Catholic Church says, okay, the truth is somewhere between those two extremes. Luther's view is, of course, that we contribute absolutely nothing to the process of justification, that even the faith that justifies us is something that is simply given to us by God and that we passively receive. And the Council of Trent certainly thought that that was wrong. They believed that, in fact, we do have the power to cooperate with grace. So when God offers us the grace that we need for justification, God allows us the freedom to either accept that faith or to reject it. Okay. Now, again, faith is very much a gift of grace. So that's a point of agreement with Luther. But we can choose to cooperate with God or not there. Okay, we can freely and indeed must freely assent or consent to faith and God's grace in order to be saved. Okay, and just to be clear, the difference with Pelagius here is Pelagius thinks that it's at least, again, theoretically possible to be saved even apart from grace. That's not the Catholic position, because the Catholic position is that faith is a supernatural, gracious gift of God to human beings, and we need faith in order to be justified. Moving on to just one other doctrine, one that was perhaps the most divisive doctrine of the entire Reformation. The Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. What happens or what doesn't happen when the Lord's Supper is celebrated? And the Catholic Church at the Council of Trent really simply reiterates its official teaching, which had been established in a kind of official way 300 years before. The Catholic Church simply reaffirmed the doctrine of transubstantiation, the notion that when the bread and the wine are consecrated by a priest, despite appearances, they are no longer bread and wine, but they actually become the body and blood of Christ. But Trent took this opportunity to also encourage Catholics to receive the Eucharist more frequently. According to church law, one only had to receive the Eucharist a minimum of once a year, but that was certainly not the ideal. And so part of the sort of renewal, the attempt of renewal of Trent was to try to encourage this more frequent reception of the Lord's Supper. Okay, so moving on to reform now. Okay, so now we're looking at attempts to reinvigorate the pastoral ministry of the church, because the bishops at Trent, I mean, they just simply could not deny the reality of the pastoral ministry of the Catholic Church was a far cry from the ideal. So the question is, how do we get a little closer to that ideal? Well, one of the biggest problems and one of the major obstacles to an effective pastoral ministry was the problem of absenteeism, or to put it positively, the issue of residence. There was a major problem, and this is something that's alluded to in Chaucer, a major problem that, priests or bishops even would be given the care of a particular parish or a particular diocese, but because of some lucrative opportunities elsewhere, they would actually spend very little time in their own precinct, and therefore very little time actually exercising pastoral care. So I just wanted to give you, and I'll read this, a quote from session 23 that addresses this problem. All to whom care of souls just means sort of pastoral ministry. All to whom care of souls has been entrusted are subject to divine command to know their sheep, to offer sacrifice for them, refers to the Eucharist, to nourish them by preaching God's word, by administering the sacraments, and by the example of good works of every kind, to have fatherly care for the poor and of all others who are wretched, and to be devoted to other pastoral duties. As none of these roles can be fulfilled by those who do not stay with and watch their flock, but desert them like hirelings, this Holy Synod charges and exhorts them to remember the divine commands, to rule and feed them with faithful wisdom. So I think you get the point. Now, this was not just a kind of exercise exercise of exhortation. This exhortation was given teeth because Trent decreed that those who do not do their job by remaining in their diocese will not receive the revenue that comes with that position. Right? So that's a pretty strong incentive to actually stay where you're supposed to stay and do your job. Well, another area of church life where there was widespread agreement that the church had fallen short was in the area of preaching. One of the main goals of the council was to increase both the quantity and quality of preaching in the church, especially on the part of bishops. A lot of bishops at this time just sort of let the friars do most of the preaching. That was kind of the friars thing. I mean, remember, the Dominicans, the official name for that order is the Order of Preachers. And that's fine. It's fine for friars to preach, but bishops and parish priests need to get in on the action as well. But that alone doesn't address the issue of quality. So how are we going to increase kind of biblical literacy and theological sophistication on the part of these preachers? Well, one of the major measures of Trent toward this end was to establish more seminaries. Okay, it mandated that every diocese, which is a sort of geographical region with a number of different congregations, every diocese should provide a seminary for the education of poor boys, non-privileged young boys who want to become priests. And this was meant to address the fact that in a lot of places, some of the priests were borderline illiterate, could hardly even read the Bible during church. And so these seminaries were meant to address that. The boys would enter at around age 11 or 12. They would be educated in grammar, in music, in scripture, the writing of the church fathers, the liturgy, the rituals of the church, and so on and so forth. And certainly, as you might imagine, some seminaries are going to be better than others. This does seem to have made an appreciable difference in the quality of the priest that the church was producing around this time. All right, well, really, I've just kind of scratched the surface of the Council of Trent, but you now know something about it. And so I'd like to think that your opinion of the Catholic Church, whatever it might be, is a bit more valuable now than it was 30 minutes ago. But again, if you want to opine on the Catholic Church of 2021, I'm afraid to say that your work is not yet done, because there is another major church council that occurs in the 1960s. It's called the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II. And really, that council sort of creates the church, the Catholic Church as it exists today. So my advice is to keep learning. Learn to earn the right to have your opinion taken seriously. Thanks for your time.